Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 9, and just a little catch up on what's been going on in the last couple issues. Swamp Thing has been making his way back to Louisiana very slowly as he heads away from Gotham, and in the last issue he ended up in some sort of old mining town, and even though the mine was abandoned, there were still people there, but they were barely making it, and it turned out that the father of the main guy that lived there, he was kind of in charge of everything. His dad ended up doing some kind of witchcraft and bringing forth some sort of elder creature from like another dimension named Nagala. And it was like living in one of these mine shafts. And the dad ended up feeding a bunch of people to it. And like, cause it kind of possessed him, was able to take over his mind. So that is why there are so little people here. And when Swamp Thing hears this story, he tries to help the people. But it turned out he was actually supposed to be a sacrifice. They were playing him. It was a trick. So when he goes into the caverns to fight Nagala, he figures out that it's some sort of trap. And then he's able to actually defeat the monster and seemingly free all the people from this town from having to make human sacrifices to this creature. But that's what it seems, because at the very end, we do see that there's some sort of growth on the headman's arm, and it kind of looks like the body of Nagala. So that is where we left off, Swamp Thing walking away from that town after he thinks he's helped them defeat the monster. So first things first, with issue 9, we got the cover, and this is one of the most iconic covers of this run. It's Swamp Thing just coming out of the water. It's a very like striking image to have if you wanted like a poster or something of Swamp Thing. This is probably going to be it, because it's just him bursting out of the water, looking all badass like he's about to fight something. And it's really well rendered, of course, because it's Bernie Wrightson artwork. So 9 times out of 10, if you've seen an image of Swamp Thing from this run, this is the most likely image you'll see if you look it up on Google. And this issue was written by Len Wein with art by Bernie Wrightson. And we start off on the first page with a train going through a wilderness area in the middle of the night. And as it chugs along, the narration says, "Night freight, clattering down out of Pittsburgh, chewing up track towards Baton Rouge. To the dreamers it passes, the old train's mournful wail brings visions of those distant exotic places they know they'll never see. But perhaps they are fortunate for this, for we shall follow the slumbering locomotive into a dream that can only be called nightmare." Then we cut to the inside of one of the train cars, and we see 2 homeless men sneaking up with a knife in their hands to a cloaked individual who's also sleeping in that boxcar. And they just look like 2 white guys who are pretty scraggly and thin. They're wearing mixed matched clothes, and they're both unshaven, and one of them has really long hair. And the man with the long hair asks, "You sure this is safe, Roof?" And Rufus replies, "Of course I am, Elmo. This bow ain't so much as twitched since we got on this freight." So Rufus reaches over and he grabs the cloak and he raises his knife in order to stab the person underneath. And as he does this, he says, "Sorry to disturb you, Bo, but just as soon as me and Elmo rob you, you can go back to..." But he's cut off as he removes the cloak fully, and he sees what's under there, and Elmo and Rufus both look terrified as the figure stands up and hovers above them. And we don't see this figure yet, we're just seeing their reaction to it. Then the next panel we see is them bursting through the wooden side of the boxcar they're in, because it seems they've been thrown by the person they tried to rob. And in this panel we see the narration say, "Apparently the silent sleeper does not like to be disturbed." And as we turn the page, we get a nice full page spread of those 2 men tumbling down the bank away from the train, and then we see Swamp Thing watching them as he stands in all the splinters of broken wood, watching from the boxcar. And the narration continues, "There is most definitely a lesson to be learned from this, but right now might not be the proper time to go into it." And as Swamp Thing watches them, he thinks to himself, "The embankment is soft. Fall shouldn't leave those 2 would-be muggers with more than a few bruises. Maybe in the future, they'll know enough to let sleeping Swamp Things lie." And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is The Stalker from Beyond. So as Swamp Thing is watching the 2 men fall into the soft bank, as he called it, the train hits a bump, and Swamp Thing loses balance, and he begins to kind of teeter right on the edge of the boxcar, about to fall out. And he thinks to himself, "Off balance, sudden lurch, pitching me out. Got to grab hold of something or... oh no, here I go again." So he loses his balance completely, and he falls out of the boxcar, and he begins rolling down the soft dirt bank. And I feel like they definitely made it seem like, okay, it has to be soft so that Swamp Thing didn't just murder a couple people. So as he tumbles down, they make sure they say it a lot. So he's thinking, "The embankment really is soft. Too soft for me to regain my footing, but I have to get back up to the train before... But as he's thinking that, he stands up and tries to regain his footing, but it's too late. The train is already gone, and as he watches the last boxcar pull away, he thinks, not a chance of catching that old freight now. Guess I'll have to start walking. So he does start walking, and as he does, the narration says, and walk the Swamp Thing does, mile after countless mile, leaving an oozy, slime-caked trail behind him. He walks, until at last, the air grows thicker, pungent with the smell of old moss and decay. A familiar smell. His smell. And then we see Swamp Thing approaching what looks like kind of like a Louisiana swamp area. There's definitely what look like willow trees and other kinds of plant life that are specific to marshy areas. And the narration continues saying, and he who was once Dr. Alec Holland knows he has come home to the stagnant swamp that spawned him. Then as we turn the page, we cut to Matt Cable and Abby Arcane, and they are on the beach looking at very stormy looking waters. And even though they're in swimsuits, Abby definitely looks like she's cold because she's like giving herself a hug so that she can keep her arms warm. And over this panel, the narration says, make it the previous afternoon on a secluded Florida beach. The sky is a dismal gray, awash with the promise of storm. The waters choppy and chill. And the heart of one Matthew Cable this day is grayer and bleaker than all of nature's wonder could ever hope to be. And as Matthew Cable sits on the beach, he looks over to Abigail, who's walking out of the water, and says, done swimming so soon, Abigail? And she replies, swimming? Freezing is more like it. Somebody must have told the ocean it's only a few weeks till Christmas. And she sees he's kind of sitting and thinking about something, and she asks, are you all right, Matthew? And Matthew Cable replies, depends on how you define the term, Abby. If you mean all right in body, yes. I've healed up just fine ever since that conclave affair, which is a reference to Swamp Thing number 4. And he continues, but if you mean all right in spirit, I don't know. I've been sitting here, Abby, thinking about myself, about the Swamp Thing, wondering if I've somehow let my unyielding hatred blind me to the truth about him. And Abby says to him, truth is such a nebulous thing, Matt. You've done what you thought was right through all of this, and perhaps... But she's cut off as someone in a suit begins running across the beach yelling at them, and he's yelling, hey, you on the beach. So Abby turns and sees the man, and she says, Matthew, someone's coming. And from his attire, I'd say he's not interested in sunbathing. Because like I said, he's in a full, like, 3-piece suit. He's got a jacket and tie and everything. And Matt Cable looks over at him and says, oh no, I recognize the expression on that face. I'll lay odds the Home Office sent him to fetch us back to Washington. And as the man finally gets close enough to talk to them normally, he begins to wring out his pants and he says, Mr. Cable, Miss Arcane, I'm Smithers. The Home Office sent me. I hate to do this on your vacation, but you're needed back in D.C. And upon having his suspicions confirmed, Matt Cable gets very angry and he kind of yells up at the sky and shakes his fist saying, I knew it. Somebody upstairs hates me. Then we cut to the Home Office and we see Matt Cable is standing in some sort of laboratory and there's 2 military people talking to each other next to him. And one of them is an older fellow who's balding and he's got gray hair and it looks like he's got more rank as well. And then we see he's talking to a younger, taller, and definitely stronger man who's smoking a cigar. And the narration over this panel says, the room you have just entered does not exist on any architect's blueprint, nor is it on file with the District of Columbia Zoning Board of Record, for it is the command base of a most unique government agency, and it is here we next find Lieutenant Matt Cable. Then we see the older military officer who's standing next to Matt Cable is saying, Matt, I'd like you to meet Captain Brad Sampson. He'll be handling the military end of this operation. And Sampson looks over at Matt Cable and gives him a once-over, and he says, so you're Cable, huh? Been hearing some pretty good things about you. Glad you'll be along for the ride. And then he gets really close to Matt Cable, and it looks like he's about a foot taller than Matt, but I don't think he's that much taller. But he continues saying, because we're riding a grade A first-class whirlwind, pal. The big boys at the Pentagon have already got a name for it. Operation Spaceface. And Matt looks up at Sampson and says, Spaceface? Hey, that doesn't mean what I think it means, does it? Then Sampson points to a wall that has the entire world mapped on it, and he says to Cable, oh, but it does, pal, it does. Seems like AID, the Agency of Interstellar Discovery, has finally earned its keep. We spotted one, boy, an honest-to-God UFO. Tracked it till it landed. Here,
Deep in the Louisiana swamplands. I wanted to take in some of my boys right away, but the brass figured since you were in charge of the Holland operation down there, you ought to tag along to make sure we don't step on any other branch's toes. And I like this about Matt Cable. He doesn't seem really intimidated by Samson. He looks him right in the eye and squares up to him and says, I'm not entirely sure I like the idea of playing nursemaid, but if that's what Uncle Sam wants, I'll do what I can to help. And then they both shake on it, and Samson says, Good, you do that, pal. Just try to keep out of the way, and we'll get along just fine. And as they shake hands, Matt thinks to himself, I don't think I'm going to like this man. Then we cut back to Swamp Thing, who is in the Louisiana swamps, and the narration says, and hours later, in the Louisiana swamplands, a certain mossy man-brute shambles hesitantly towards the single wooden structure that rises from the bog. And the structure they're talking about is the barn that was originally Alec and Linda Holland's lab, which I actually thought was totally exploded, but maybe just part of it got exploded and burned up in the fire that created Swamp Thing. So as Swamp Thing sees the barn, he thinks to himself, there it is. The story of the Swamp Thing began in that old converted barn. Then he walks over to the barn and he sees the doors are locked with chains, but he's able to break the shackle with his hands. And as he does, he thinks, all boarded up now. Must have taken almost everything with them when they closed down. But if they left anything behind, anything at all, I'll have a starting place to begin the work of curing my... And then as he opens the barn doors and peers in, his thoughts are cut off, and he says to himself, Lord! And then he walks in to reveal a giant spacecraft that has been set up in the middle of this barn, and it's hooked to all the machinery that I guess was left over from the laboratory experiments of Linda and Alec Holland. And as Swamp Thing stares at the craft, he thinks, a spacecraft, surely never designed by any astrophysicist of this Earth. It's banged up pretty badly. This pilot must have brought it into the haven of this old barn for repairs. Well, I suppose that's his business. As long as he doesn't interfere with my work, he can. But his thoughts are cut off as he notices that the machinery he was going to use to help him work out a cure for himself is what's connected to the spacecraft. So he rushes over to the machinery and he thinks, oh God, no! Some equipment was left behind, but it's been dismantled. Its components used to repair that blasted ship. I'm finished. My last hope to discover a cure. Ruined. If I could get my hands on the one responsible for this, I'd... But then Swamp Thing hears a noise from behind him, and he turns around, and we get a full-page splash of the one who's responsible for all of this, the alien that crash-landed in that spacecraft. And I'll do my best to describe this alien. He is wearing a spacesuit that's all orange. He's got red boots and gloves, and a big helmet that has a glass dome in the front. So we can see its face, and it kind of looks like a frog or some sort of amphibian. It's got green skin, and it's got what looks like a mouth in the front, and it has really big red eyes. And it also has a gas tank on the back of it that it's breathing from, and it also has a staff or possibly a weapon in its right hand. And the staff/weapon is made of metal, but it looks like you took two flutes and put them together, and where the two meet, there is a glass orb with some kind of electronics in it. It also has a utility belt around its waist that has lots of different doodads and whatnot, and there's definitely a knife pouch on this belt. So it definitely has at least one weapon with it. And as Swamp Thing turns around and sees this monster, we get some narration over this panel that says, lacking any certain knowledge of its proper gender, we will call this creature it, nor will we feel it any insult to the creature's obvious intelligence for doing so, for it is equally frustrated in attempting to determine the identity of the muck-encrusted monstrosity we have come to know so well. But the Swamp Thing, fortunately, is at no such uncomfortable loss for words. But it's funny because what's written for Swamp Thing isn't words he's saying out loud, it's actually his thoughts, and he's thinking, Dear Lord in heaven, look at the size of that creature. It stands as tall as I am, and it must outweigh me by several 100 pounds. So I guess Swamp Thing slowly approaches it, and the alien prepares itself for an attack, so it grabs its staff with two hands, and as it does, the narration says, For a moment, these two awesome behemoths stand, each studying the other, as if trying to decide how to deal with this unexpected situation. The alien from space peers at the Swamp Thing, and wonders if all who inhabit this primitive little world are as frightening in their visage, while the alien from Earth wonders, in turn, what sort of hell-spawned monster would steal away a man's final chance to regain his humanity? So basically, both of them are just staring at each other and deciding whether to attack or not. And the narration continues. Then, unable to contain his seething rage any longer, the swamp brute acts, and his star-born opponent reacts with staggering speed. And it turns out that staff was a weapon because a laser immediately shoots out as Swamp Thing goes to grab the alien, and it blows off Swamp Thing's right hand. And as it does, Swamp Thing thinks, huh? That ray of his disintegrated my hand. But luckily, the alien only shoots once, so as Swamp Thing holds out his right arm, which is now a stump on the hand, we see that plants begin to sprout from the stump, and his hand begins to form again. And as it does, he continues thinking, but if he thinks that will keep me from making him pay for what he's done to my hopes, my dreams, he's wrong, dead wrong. And once his hand is fully formed again, he reaches out and he grabs the business end of the weapon and he crushes it and he bends the barrel upwards, which of course disables it. And we can see the alien's face as this is going on, and there's not much emotion that can be conveyed with his giant red eyes and his face that doesn't really have very expressive musculature, but it does look like it's somewhat surprised. Then Swamp Thing reaches out and grabs the face mask of the creature, and he thinks to himself, what I did to your weapon, Ugly, is only a sample of what I'm going to do to you. But as Swamp Thing grabs hold of the face mask, the creature leans back and he kicks Swamp Thing with all his might, and it kind of looks like his feet are just big cylinders in these boots. They look kind of like elephant's feet. And unfortunately, as Swamp Thing flies backwards, he flies into all the machinery that he was going to use to help him come up with a cure. But he doesn't only hit that stuff, he also hits one of the support beams that was supporting the spaceship above it, which causes the spaceship to fall on top of Swamp Thing, seemingly killing him. And as the alien looks on the motionless Swamp Thing, the narration says, the reverberations fade and the old barn floods up with silence, with mute accusations that swirl about the Swamp Thing's sprawled, unmoving body. And if one could discern emotion in the alien's immobile face, one might discover it suffused with regret. So the alien picks up Swamp Thing's body and he just decides to go put it in the waters of the swamp. So as he walks to the water's edge with Swamp Thing in his hands, the narration says, silence seems to follow the alien creature as it carries a muck-encrusted body into the swampland that surrounds the old barn. The leaves cease their rustling as the space traveler passes. The birds hesitate in their song, but still the alien moves onward, as if somehow sensing the bizarre bond that exists between its victim and this marsh. Then softly, it lays its mossy burden down at the stagnant water's edge, and if it believes in some supreme deity, perhaps the alien offers up a prayer for the Swamp Thing's soul, before it gently rolls the moss-wet body back into the clammy embrace of the bog. Then solemnly, remorsefully, the alien turns and shambles back towards its work, leaving behind only a handful of bilious bubbles to mark the final resting place of what once had been a man. So as you heard in that narration, the alien tossed Swamp Thing into the water, and Swamp Thing sank below. Then we cut to a short while later and a short distance away, and we see the military men have mobilized, with Samson as their leader and Matt Cable there to show them the way. So Matt Cable calls back to the men, not much farther now, gents. And Samson, who's right behind Cable, says, how much is not much, Cable? I'm starting to get itchy. And one of the other men says, know what you mean, Captain, sir. These special suits the lab boys designed for us might be great for keeping the heat out, but mosquitoes? Forget it. But just as the man says that, Matt Cable pushes through the trees and into the open, revealing the barn that Alec and Linda Holland were killed at, and Matt Cable points to it and says, there, you can scratch your itch in just a minute, Samson. That's the old barn I told you about. We can set up operations there. And Samson replies, then let's get with it, Cable. Sooner we hunt up the UFO, the better. So all the men walk to the barn and they open the doors, and they immediately, of course, see the alien and the UFO just sitting there in the barn. And one of them yells out, I don't believe it. And Samson says, the UFO stashed right in the barn. Lord, ship ain't nothing like I ever saw on this earth. And another man says, yeah, and neither is the thing that owns it. Look. So the men walk over to the alien, and they all have their guns drawn. And as they approach, Samson says, "We've got to figure out how to communicate with it. Discover where it comes from, and..." But he's cut off as the alien makes a move and pulls something out that looks kind of like a weapon. And one of the men yells, "Hey, that monster's pulling a weapon on us, but he ain't gonna waste me." So the man fires and shoots the weapon out of the alien's hand. And this kind of startles everyone, and Matt Cable yells to the man, "Hold your fire, Private Optic, now! That device looks more like a welding torch than a weapon. Besides, our orders are to bring back anything we find out here alive." But then Samson turns to Matt Cable and says, "Alive, huh? That's easy for the brass back home to say. They ain't standing here facing that brute. But if that's the way they want it..." But then Samson is cut off by Private Optic, who just runs at the alien saying, "Then that's the way they'll get it, right, Captain, sir?" And as it looks like Private Optic is about to tackle the alien, Samson yells, "O'Reilly, you fool! Come back here! I didn't give the order!" But it's too late, as the alien punches Optic O'Reilly right in the face. And as he does this, the narration says, "At first, the alien was startled, for these new intruders seemed so unlike the one it had accidentally slain. But only in appearance, for they too attacked unprovoked, forcing it again to defend itself, and in doing so, to learn a new thing. When these small creatures are struck, they break." So O'Reilly falls to the ground, and I feel like Bertie Wrightson really wanted him to be dead because it literally looks like his neck is snapped. But this is a 70s comic, so as O'Reilly's limp body hits the ground, Samson yells out, "O'Reilly! So help me, if that monster hurt the kid, I'll..." But he's cut off as Matt Cable reaches down to inspect O'Reilly's limp body, and he says, "O'Reilly's just dazed, but look at the alien." And we get some narration right before Matt Cable continues what he's saying, and it says, "This is the second life the alien has almost taken on this strange world, and that thought is nearly more than it can bear." And we can see the alien is looking down at O'Reilly's body, and he's looking kind of sad, and Matt Cable looks at it and kind of thinks he can read his body language, and he tells the soldiers, "It's not moving. It's almost as if it regrets what it's done." But Samson pushes past Cable, and I guess since the alien isn't moving, Samson feels comfortable enough to put handcuffs on the alien, so he takes its hands and he slaps a very fancy-looking pair of handcuffs around its wrists, and he says, "Yeah, well, I don't regret what I'm about to do. Don't regret it one bit." Then we turn the page, and the narration says, "It's nearly dusk when Matt Cable and his companions at last make camp a short distance from the moldering barn." So we see all the men setting up tents and like a radio and stuff, and we also see that they've tied the alien to a tree. And it's still handcuffed, and it's just standing there watching everything these soldiers are doing. So Matt Cable, as he's setting up his stuff, looks at Samson and says, "We're better off out here. Less chance of us accidentally destroying any of the alien's equipment. Lord knows what scientific knowledge might be lost that way. And speaking of that, don't you think we ought to let home base know how things went, Samson?" And Samson, who doesn't really seem to be paying attention and also seems to be hiding something, says, "Huh? Oh, sure." And then he turns to one of his men and says, "Trumbo, get on the horn and contact the base. Tell them to send in a chopper in the morning for us and our special, package." And Trumbo replies, "Yes, sir, Captain, right away." And then he moves over to the radio, and as he moves the dials, he says, "I can't understand it, Captain. The radio don't seem to be working." And then Samson goes over to it and says, "Not working? Any idea what's wrong?" And as Trumbo takes a look at the back of it, he notices something is out of place, and he says, "Don't know, sir. She checked out A-OK at the base, but what in the master transmitter tube? It's gone. And without it, we ain't calling nobody for nothing." Then Matt Cable goes over to look at the radio, and he sarcastically looks at Samson and says, "Swell. Then we may never get the alien out of this swamp." Then Samson, who's got his hands behind his back, and we can see that he's hiding a radio tube, so it seems he is the one that sabotaged the radio. And he looks Matt Cable square in the eyes and says, "Looks like we got ourselves a problem then, don't it? Wonder where that flaming radio tube went to anyhow." Then we come back to the swamp, specifically the area where the alien had dropped Swamp Thing's body, and we see some bubbles forming on the surface of the water, and the narration says, "While a dozen yards away, as if recoiling from Captain Samson's cold-blooded sarcasm, the stagnant swamp waters begin to ripple and stir. Brackish bubbles are belched up anew to break the mire's surface, followed by what has now become a most familiar hand. Then we see Swamp Thing's hand reaching out of the water and break the surface, and then Swamp Thing's body soon follows as he stands up, and the narration continues, saying, "His very essence is restored by the chemical-tainted ooze that conceived him. The Swamp Thing lives again, if one could truly call this living. So Swamp Thing pulls himself out of the water onto the bank. He thinks to himself, thought that falling rocket had killed me, but this cursed bog revived me somehow. I don't know how long I've been out, so I'd best get back to the barn as quickly as possible. So he begins to walk back towards the barn, and as he does, he thinks, I still have a score to settle with a certain alien squatter who... But his thoughts are cut off as he hears a noise, so he sneaks over and he peers out of some bushes, and he sees these soldiers' encampment, and he thinks, this is not quite at all what I'd expected. The alien, a prisoner of Matt Cable and 5 others. Better keep out of sight until I know exactly what's going on. And as the men prepare to go to sleep, we can hear them from the camp saying, look at that ugly brute, standing there quiet as a tomb. You know, if I was a religious man, I'd swear it was an agent of the devil himself. Then we cut to inside the camp where the men are continuing the conversation, and we see O'Reilly say, you're right. That creature would have to be pure evil to hit me like it did. And Trumbo replies to this saying, near as I can recall, O'Reilly, you hit him first. And then Samson cuts in saying, maybe, but at least O'Reilly's human. And O'Reilly replies, personally, I think we ought to kill the monster ourselves and save Uncle Sam the bother. And another soldier chimes in saying, you nuts, O'Reilly? That creature's worth more to science than 1,000 of you. Then another soldier cuts in saying, says who? Me? I agree with O'Reilly. We ought to waste the creep. And the man who asked if O'Reilly was nuts answers this saying, if men like you and O'Reilly had their way, we'd all still be living in the Dark Ages. Then O'Reilly turns to the man who said they ought to waste the alien and says, hey, you some kind of bigot, Twitchit? And Twitchit replies, yeah, it's our duty to kill that monster before it can infect the world with its poisons. Then Trumbo stands up and says, your duty? Come on, Twitchit. Why don't you just admit you're afraid of what the alien can teach us? I'll also throw in here that Trumbo is the only one out of the men who's black, and everybody else is white. So that might be why he has a different outlook about people's prejudices. So he continues kind of lecturing to O'Reilly and Twitchit saying, admit it, you're afraid of progress. And Twitchit replies very ominously saying, that monster lives, Trumbo, and I swear we'll all regret it. Then Samson cuts in saying, that's enough yapping, let's eat. Then we cut to later that night when all the men are asleep, all except Samson. It looks like he's pretending to sleep, and he's keeping an eye on the alien. But he also looks very suspicious, and that's because he does intend to do something. He quietly gets up, and he pulls a gun out of his bag, and then he walks over to the alien, and he chambers around, and then he points the gun at the alien, but before he fires, he whispers, you've been listening, haven't you, monster? You heard everything we said tonight, didn't you? Well, they're right, you know. Twitchit and O'Reilly. You are a menace, a disease. Bring you back to civilization, and every bleeding heart kid in the country will have a new cause to rally around. Sure, I can see the headlines now. Menace or Messiah. Hell, without half trying, you could become the most powerful thing on Earth, and I can't allow that. Then he points the barrel of the gun at the head of the alien through its glass helmet, and he continues saying, you're foreign, a damned alien. You don't belong here. And I'm not going to let you stay and destroy what little chance this planet has left. You understand this is nothing personal, don't you? Just thought you should know the reasons why. And then he pulls the trigger, and the gun does fire, but luckily, just as the gun went off, it turned out Swamp Thing has snuck into the camp, and he was able to grab the gun and pull it upward so the bullet missed the alien. And Swamp Thing was standing behind Samson, so he didn't see what it was. He just saw a green hand reach out, grab the gun, and then as he looks around, Swamp Thing has disappeared. And of course, all the other men have woken up from the gunshot, and Matt Cable says, what's going on? Who? Samson, what in God's name are you doing with that gun? And Samson tries to lie and says, it was a bear. Caught one sneaking into camp and took a shot at it. But Matt Cable ain't buying it. He gets right into Samson's face and begins to yell, I've got news for you, Samson. There are no bears in the bayou. You were trying to shoot the alien, weren't you, maniac? Weren't you? And Samson gets right in his face and says, and what if I was, bright boy? I was doing it to save your skin, too. I'm doing it to save everybody before that monster destroys us all from within. And I'll kill anyone who tries to stop me. And then he punches Matt Cable right in the face and knocks him to the ground. But before he can do anything else, Trumbo actually tackles Samson to the ground and says, hope you don't mind me saying so, Captain Sir, But you've gone out of your ever-loving mind. Then all the other soldiers jump in, and they begin to fight each other. So Samson is fighting Matt Cable, and Trumbo is fighting with, I think it's Twitchett or O'Reilly, and then 2 other guys are fighting in the background as well. And over this fight scene, the narration says, "Save the creature or slay it." The matter had indeed seemed quite rhetorical, but Samson's violent action and Trumbo's violent response have made that question the crux of a desperate conflict, as men who had been friends of a sort mere hours ago struggle to resolve the question in mankind's usual fashion. So while this fight is going on, we see the alien just watching this, and the narration over this panel says, "The alien observes all this in silence, its lidless eyes never wavering from the scene of combat. Perhaps it wonders at what fools these creatures be. Perhaps." Then we get a shot from inside the woods of the swamp looking at the camp, and we can barely see anybody, but then we hear 2 gunshots. And it doesn't seem like anyone gets injured, but it does stop everybody from fighting. And this really freaks out Matt Cable, and he turns to the men and says, "Stop! For God's sake, stop shooting! One of these shots is liable to hit the alien." And as he turns to look at where the alien should be, all that's left are the handcuffs and the chains that were tying him to the tree. Then we cut to a panel of Swamp Thing helping the alien away from that area, and we get some narration saying, "In fact, Matt Cable, one of those wild shots has already done just that. Instance before, a moss-encrusted monstrosity tore the alien's shackles asunder, then moved to help the fast-weakening wayfarer back to the musty old barn, and the great gleaming ship within." And we see Swamp Thing and the alien make it all the way back to the barn, and we see Swamp Thing helping the alien back into the ship. And as Swamp Thing's about to go back down the ladder, the alien puts his hand on Swamp Thing's shoulder, and they both have like a moment where they look at each other and they understand. And the narration says, "No words need be spoken here." The alien places its extremity upon the mossy man-brute's shoulder in a universal gesture, a gesture that has a rather singular effect. The Swamp Thing vanishes. So it seems Swamp Thing thought the alien was like giving him a thank you bro hug or something, but it seems like the alien just teleports Swamp Thing away, I'm assuming so he doesn't get hurt. And then the alien moves to go into its ship again, and someone yells out, "Don't move! Stop where you are, or..." But Samson, who is yelling, is cut off as the alien pulls out a weapon and fires it at the men, and this weapon doesn't kill them, it actually surrounds them in an impenetrable bubble. And then the alien surprisingly talks and says,
"No, this time it is you who will stop."
And O'Reilly says, "Huh? He's thrown up some sort of force field around us, and he's talking." And the alien walks over to them and says,
"Yes, I have heard enough of your language at last to communicate with you, but what I have heard sickens me. I came to you in peace, but I have found only violence here. I landed here by accident, a victim of a cosmic storm. I needed only your help in repairing my ship and would have given you much in return, but now all I have for you is pity."
And then the Swamp Thing gets into his ship and he starts it up. And as he does that, the bubble begins to dissolve so the men can get out of the barn before the engines ignite. And it does make sure to show you that the soldiers do get out before the plane takes off. So as it takes off, the barn explodes, I guess just from the pressure of the engines blasting off. And the narration says, "It makes surprisingly little sound for something so awesome. This great gleaming vessel of the stars. There's an initial roar as tongues of flame are pushed against the damp earth. The splintering crash as the shining stellar arrow erupts through the old barn roof. Then only a low whistle, like the trilling of melancholy birds. And like a bird, it soars, arching skyward, singing the praises of the stars. But then we see the spacecraft suddenly jerks to the right and then begins to spiral out. And the narration continues saying, only to falter at heaven's very gate, there to plead silently for less than a moment. Then, like Icarus coming too near the sun, to fall. Then we see the spacecraft take a sudden dive and crash into the earth and burst into a ball of flames. Then we cut to some time later as the fire around the wreckage burns, and we see Swamp Thing just staring at it, and we get a narrated conversation between Matt Cable and Samson over these panels of a very sad Swamp Thing looking at the wreckage of this ship. And Matt Cable sarcastically says, "Well, Samson, are you happy now? You won't have to worry about the alien anymore." And Samson replies, Of course I'm happy, Cable. That monster was evil, a menace.
And Cable replies, "You still believe that? Even after what the aliens said? Why, Samson? Because he was different? Because he wasn't human?" And Samson snaps back,
"Don't play so high and mighty with me, Cable. I'll bet there's something in your life that you felt exactly the same about."
And Matt Cable gets very defensive at this and says,
"Don't be ridiculous, Samson. Oh my God, Samson. There is.
And under this narration, we see Swamp Thing walking away. So obviously, Matt Cable has had a realization that he was after Swamp Thing just because he looked different than him, and that was completely wrong, and that it was exactly the same as the way Samson thought about the alien. And with Matt Cable's revelation and that little moral lesson, we end the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.